But before we render it, we have to add a light into our scene. So we'll go to Arnold, and if you're not seeing this Arnold menu here, just go to Windows, Settings Preferences, Plugin Manager, search for the MTOA plugin, that's Maya to Arnold, and load that in. So that should bring up this menu here, which is the Arnold menu. And go to Lights, and we'll create a sky dome light. And this is just a sphere around your scene. I'll click this exposure just to bring my exposure back down to regular. And this created this giant sphere around our scene, and we'll add a texture to this to drive the lighting. So what we're doing is adding our 360 HDRI. So if you go back to our footage here, this is what our footage looks like. And on set, we used a 360 camera to capture multiple exposures of this environment. And then those are all combined into a 32-bit HDR file, which we can load into our Maya scene. So select your sky dome light in the attribute editor, scroll over to the second tab, and in the color attribute, load in a file, and we'll bring in our 360 HDRI. It'll take a second to load in because it's a big file. But once it's loaded in, we can see even more than what was in the footage. We've got the back side of the camera, we even see the silk that was in the scene, we can see some of the crew back there. All that's not super important. It's just going to affect the lighting from this side. So it's important to see this silk here because that's going to actually be casting light onto our model. And while technically, yes, this crew will appear in the reflections of our model, it's very unlikely that we'll actually be able to discern them. So I usually just leave them in. But you could paint those out in Photoshop if you wanted. So now that we have our HDRI in there, that'll be lighting our model, and we have our model textured. So let's kick out a render and see how it's looking. So we'll go to our Arnold tab, and we'll just hit render. This will open up the Arnold render view window, and it'll take a second because it's got to convert all your textures into the .tx format that Arnold can work with. So just give it a second to pop up with the render window. And you'll see it starts rendering. You can zoom out a bit. And now we're starting to really see that metalness. So it's looking very dark, so I want to bring the exposure of my HDRI up. So I'm going to stop this render. It's important to hit this red square here. Otherwise, you'll continue rendering constantly. So as we rotate our camera, it'll be updating this render view. So we want to stop that. So let's hit the stop button. And I'll select my HDRI in the background here. In my attribute editor, I'll bring this exposure to, let's bring it up to 2. And I'll hit play on the render again and see how that's looking. So that's much brighter. I can finally see the detail in the texture. It's looking really cool, actually. I think I want to bring this metalness down a bit. It's just a little too shiny. So I'll select my model again, and I'll go to my material at the very end, M-Robot. I'll find my metalness, and I'll bring this, I'll just cut this in half. I'll do a 0.5, and let's see how that's looking. And what's nice about this constant rendering is I can start changing these values. Let's say I change it to 0.2. I can see that updating in real time. And I actually really like how 0.2 looks there, so I'm going to leave it like that. The other thing I want to do is I don't want to actually see this background in my render. I just want it to affect the lighting. So I'm going to select my HDRI. First I'll stop my render. Select my HDRI, and we'll go down to visibility. And under camera, we'll bring this all the way down to 0. So it'll still affect the lighting of our object, but it won't actually show in the camera view. So now we're getting a nice looking CG render, and now we just need to position our camera properly